Okay, I think we can start now. Thank you, Haneen, for the introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, partners and friends and colleagues, it's a pleasure to connect with all of you today. And thank you for joining us for yet another webinar for COVID-19 and implications of COVID-19 on the agenda of the T20. I would like to give a special thanks to our lead co-chair, Dr. Susanna Qarashi, and also the coordinator for this task force, Haneen Siddes, as well as the lead co-chairs of this task force for present with us today for organizing this webinar in a very critical time. Let me first note that the COVID-19 pandemic is above all is a human tragedy. And perhaps the most significant civilizational threat that we have faced in our lifetime. By now, the virus has spread to more than 4 million people in over 180 countries. An infection rate that we have never seen in more than a century. It has a major implication and impact, an adverse impact on the healthcare system, the economy, the market, and more importantly for this task force, on our social life. On the health side, even a very strong and well-funded healthcare systems are struggling to keep up with the spread of the virus, even with introduction of strict social distancing measures. The economic implications of this pandemic and the social implications of this pandemic are very clear. From the economic side, the growth, global economic growth is turning into negative territory. The IMF is forecasting -3 for this year, and about 4 to 5% positive next year, which I still think this is a very optimistic next year. Unemployment is rising in many countries. We start to see the early data showing double digits in countries like the US and many European countries. SMEs are going out of business, and even large corporations are facing difficulties with the management of their cash flow. And more importantly for this task force, inequality is deepening. And also we are unable to meet the need of the most vulnerable households, including the elderly and vulnerable citizens in many places. So countries facing this pandemic are also facing two hard and contradicting choices. On one side, if they don't act immediately in lockdown, they risk thousands of deaths from COVID-19 and also overwhelming their healthcare system. Alternatively, if they shut down the economy, they would risk an economic collapse and a high mortality from non-COVID-19 reasons, probably due to poverty, especially in poorer places. So we should learn from our experience and from previous crises, where global unity and solidarity should be on top of our priorities. We highlighted in many of our statements as the T20 that we are in urgent actual need of investments in critical public services and global public goods to first suppress the virus spread and then minimize the social and economic impact of this pandemic, and to eventually emerge of it on a stronger footing, a more sustainable economy, and more resilient society. And I think the resilient society concept is an important priority for this task force, which also includes reducing inequality and promoting citizens' welfare, bridging the cross-generational divide, improving the governance, legitimacy, and accountability and trust of state institutions. And in this context, I'm glad to have Jihad Al-Yahya with us today to give an opening remark on the role of the working group on anti-corruption at the G20. And also other issues are related to this task force include fostering social cohesion through innovative policies and programs, supporting civil society and women empowerment, and the role of cultural capital, and last but not least, the social inclusion of migrants. What we did in T20 over the last 3 months to support a number of these priorities for this task force is through issuing a number of statements before and after the G20 Extraordinary Summit that was held at the end of March. In this statement, we called for a coordinated stimulus package to allocate resources to households, workers, and businesses, especially in less developing countries. Some of our recommendations that are related to this task force include scaling up the cash transfer measures, introducing insurance and wage support schemes, and enhancing social protection systems. Needless to say that based on our experience during previous crises and from the literature review, that countries with strong social protection system get affected the least by these similar of these crises, and usually recover most quickly relative to other countries. And thus, they should stand ready to help other countries who are less fortunate or less developed. So I would like to thank the lead co-chair for giving us this opportunity to gather and meet with the co-chairs of the task force and the members of the task force. And it is an event like this that emphasizes the importance of the think tank, as well as the think tank contribution to the global community on meeting global challenges such as COVID-19. It is in this context of this task force that the crisis has also highlighted that countries should not, and they will realize that they will not be able to take social cohesion for granted. It's on the other side. It underscores that there is a need for these countries to calibrate their social policies to reduce inequality, protect the vulnerable sections within the communities, and promote fairness in access to opportunities. So I encourage you all as members of this task force to actively participate within the discussion today, and also within the sequence of our task force or webinars that are happening this week and within the next few weeks, and maintain our mandate as a T20 to provide unbiased research-based policy recommendations to the leaders of the world. And in this particular occasion, and as we meet during this difficult times, I would like to remind everybody that we may need to go beyond only providing research-based policy recommendations. We need also to think about initiatives for the leaders of the G20 within the context of the social cohesion and resilient societies. To conclude, I would like to say once again that the T20 and its partners are devoting their times and efforts to help the world in facing the pandemic. And events like this bring us together and encourage us to share our expertise. I look forward to working with all of you and with our partners in G20s and G20 countries and outside the G20 countries to expedite a transition to recovery while maintaining our global social values. Thank you for your time, and back to you, Hanin.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fahad, for this insightful opening. Now I would like to welcome Jihad Al-Yahya, representative of Anti-Corruption Working Group, G20 Saudi Arabia. If you would like to take the mic, Jihad. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to make sure, does everyone hear me? Okay.
Yes, everybody's
okay.
hearing you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I just want to make sure. Well, again, good afternoon, everyone. Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Jihad Al Yahya, and I am here on behalf of the chair of the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group. First, I would like to echo the welcome giving by Ms. Haneen and Dr. Fahad, and thank you all for joining us today. Second, I would like to express my gratitude for the invitation to join you all today, as well as for the exceptional thought leadership that the T20 and its task forces have and continue to showcase in studying a number of crucial topics for our societies. Before I begin, I would like to briefly express how deeply saddened we all are by the loss of life and suffering caused by the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. There is no way on earth that has been left unaffected by this terrible virus and its profound impacts on not just on health, but on the very fabric of our societies. The restrictions to our daily lives that have been required as responses to this pandemic through social distancing and travel restriction, amongst others, are testing our ability to engage are testing our ability to engage as societies remotely. We have to find new ways to work, to socialize, and to interact with our loved ones. But at the same time, it has caused a significant amount of pain. It is also showing the best that our societies have to offer, and I would like to pay special tribute to all of the healthcare workers, other essential workers, and volunteers who have put their lives selflessly at risk to protect others and to maintain the functioning of our countries. I believe there is no greater example of social cohesion at the present time than in how our countries and communities have pulled together to stand united in our collective response. As the Anti-Corruption Working Group, however, we would like to highlight the specific issue of corruption and the effects that has in our communities. Harmony between the state and its citizens and between the public and the private sectors is critical to the functioning of our societies. At the core of this lies a relationship of mutual trust, respect for the rule of law, and commitment to our social good. Corruption is a threat to all of these foundations, eroding both the trust in and the legitimacy of the state, and ultimately hindering progress in achieving our sustainable development goals through the well-being and the prosperity of our communities. If we are to achieve our goal of furthering social cohesion, it is essential that we apply our full and collective efforts to combat the threat posed by corruption. The unfolding pandemics provides a strong example of tangible effects that has in our daily lives. All sectors can be vulnerable to corruption in normal lives, in normal times. In the healthcare, for example, there can be issues around the bribery in the procurement, self-dealing with large public sector contracts, and transparency over research and development. However, we are currently not living in normal times, and the healthcare is one of the areas where the corruption risk have been exacerbated remarkably by the ongoing situation. To further elaborate, the immediate need for medical supplies and unprecedented demand for healthcare services and increases focus on developing a vaccine are key factors in raising the corruption risk level in the health sector. The need for suppliers, for example, raises the risk of organized crime groups stealing medical products to sell at elevated prices or to divert to other sources. The demand for care increases bribery where state employees and medical decision makers are illegally influenced to ensure that they prioritize certain individuals. And with such a rush to find a vaccine or medicine to treat the virus, there is a heightened risk of companies altering test results to gain approval for their medications or bribing officials to obtain this. These are just a few examples among many other risks that are possible. As a compounding factor, checks and balances around public spending have been softened in many countries as a result of the emergency situation. Whilst this has helped to ensure that the equipment can be procured with the necessary speed to respond quickly to the pandemic, it also increases the risk of misuse of public resources due to opportunism by some corrupt actors. Once such risk, for example, is in the public officials signing public contracts with companies owned by themselves or their associates at elevated prices through self-dealing or embezzlement in the procurement process. We have seen allegations of a number of these examples already, which lead to limiting the resources of the state to fight the pandemic, weakening national responses, and harming public health. In the longer term, societies look to their public officials and governments for leadership in times of a crisis. More specifically, if such acts were to be proven to have harmed countries' abilities to respond to the pandemic, this could have a profound effect on trust in the state. We recognize that corruption is only one aspect of the wide range of the topics within the remit of the T20's social cohesion and the state task force. However, in the spirit of fostering collaboration between our groups, I would like to briefly highlight the work done by the Anti-Corruption Working Group in identifying the specific corruption risk in vulnerable sectors, as this may help you to inform your own thinking in this area. Of particular relevance, the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group has developed a set of high-level principles on corruption and growth, which was endorsed by the G20 leaders in 2014. Such principles were then supplemented by a document on the consequences of corruption at the sector level and implications for economic growth and development. The latter document provides cross-sectoral analysis and policy implications on corruption and growth, with key focus on highlighting risk in vulnerable sectors. Hence, the health sector was identified and associated measures were adopted in this area. With regard to the current response to the crisis, the Anti-Corruption Working Groups seeks to leverage experience across G20 countries through creating an initial view on anti-corruption policies by introducing a robust tool that helps prepare countries, even beyond the G20 scope, to respond to future pandemics and crises without compromising on risk controls. This tool is supported by the Anti-Corruption Working Group Action Plan 2019-2021, which mandates G20 countries to deepen anti-corruption measures on vulnerable sectors, as well as per the G20 Extraordinary Leaders Summit held in March 26, 2020. I would also like to highlight the work done in this regard by international organizations with whom we work closely, such as the OECD, UNODC, FATF, and the World Bank. To conclude, I would like to re-express my thanks for the opportunity to provide the opening remarks at this webinar on social cohesion and the state. I hope the viewpoints that I have provided from an anti-corruption perspective have proven useful, and I look forward to the discussions to come through the remainder of the seminar. And right now, I would like to refer back to my colleague, Hani. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jihad, for this very comprehensive remarks. Now I would like to welcome Dr. Fernando Figuera, a professor of social sciences at the University of the Republic of Uruguay. He will give us the keynote on using safety net at the time of COVID-19. We are very delighted to have you, Dr. Fernando, and thank you so much for joining us. And it's over to you now.
Thank you, Haneen, and thank you, Fahad and Jihad, for those introductory remarks on the challenges facing the world in terms of social cohesion and the role of trust and anti-corruption policies to do that. I will be presenting a short PowerPoint on the importance of social safety nets or basic social protection floors in the time of COVID-19, and as it relates particularly to the epidemiological strategies that countries around the world are developing, trying to contain the virus and the social disruption that it brings about. Let me first mention that as we look into the information that's coming out of the global databases regarding the evolution of the pandemic in the world, these are the countries that now are entering the top 20 positions of new cases and new deaths. Brazil, India, Peru, Chile, Mexico, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, South Africa, Indonesia, Ecuador, Chile, Egypt. The pandemic is coming to the global south. The exponential growth phase of the pandemic is coming to the global south. And the countries, when we look at the stringency index of the measures being taken by these different countries as they confront the emergence and expansion of the pandemic, shows again that some of the harshest confinement, lockdown, and social distancing measures are taking place now in the global south. Of course, this brings with it major challenges for social welfare and social well-being. Next slide. Next. Basically, we're trying to say that to avoid a humanitarian crisis and to sustain the epidemiological strategy of social distance, social assistance must reach far and fast in the global south, widely and in a longer term. Even then, some major deficits in matters of social welfare and basic infrastructure will make such strategies unsustainable for long periods of time. Still, with the immediate and still to come socioeconomic effects, a large portion of the population will fall into poverty and lose access to basic utilities and food security, unless, of course, we put in place the kind of social safety net that I'm going to try to propose to you. This requires, of course, both political will at the domestic arena, but also, very importantly, at the global level. Next slide. Basic data from the World Development Indicators of the World Bank show that low income, lower middle income, and upper middle income countries share to differing degrees traits that make them vulnerable to a humanitarian crisis under a lockdown strategy if no social mitigation takes place. High proportions of the population living in poverty or just above poverty levels, high informality with low levels of social security coverage, a large presence of the population living in slums, important percentages of the population with undernourishment, and also important groups with lack of access to basic utilities. All this data that I did gather, I did not put together in the PowerPoint. It would be too much, but basically, let me provide just one example. We can look at the graphs there and see the levels of poverty at different poverty thresholds by countries' levels of income. In low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, and upper middle-income countries. Of course, in high-income countries, that's extremely low. And furthermore, if we go down one graph, what we can see is the percentage of population with the risk of falling into poverty. That's basically a simple calculation made out of looking at the next bracket and how much of a percentage of population is in that next bracket after a given poverty threshold, between a level of income that's small enough that minor shocks might take them into poverty. Major shocks, as the ones we're living, will definitely and probably lead them to a situation of poverty. Next slide. This is an apparent trilemma, and the possible and necessary solution that we believe has to be put in place. It's almost impossible to get to these three goals at the same time unless we put in place a wide and adequate social safety net, not just for the duration of the lockdowns or the immediate and harsh lockdowns that we embrace as we face the first phase of the pandemic in our countries, but also for a longer run. We cannot maximize our epidemiological strategy, be it the phase of lockdowns, be it the phase of dancing as we get contagious down, and at the same time minimize social costs and sustain a stable political environment unless we put in place these safety nets. People will develop survival strategies that require mobility if we don't provide the safety nets. We can coerce the population into confinement and make them suffer the social costs, yet this can lead to massive uprisings and social conflict. Thus, there is only one way to achieve the desirable outcome depicted by the figure on this slide, and this is a wide, inclusive, basic emergency social protection floor or social safety net. Next. I propose to you that there are at least 4 critical ingredients that have to be granted for an effective social safety net to operate. People need to have access to basic utilities, water, electricity, communication. They require a basic minimum income for food and basic needs. Alternatively, reaching the population with food programs and assets can also fulfill part of this second condition. Essential health services need to reach the population, and security, or a broader term than security, maybe secure livelihoods in communities and neighbors need to be guaranteed. Of course, we know that as the pandemic reaches the global south, already these 4 basic ingredients of a safety net are not present for a large part of the population. But we need to find innovative solutions to provide in an emergency setting these capacities to communities, or we will face not only a humanitarian crisis, but the breakdown of any effective epidemiological strategy and eventually major political unrest. Now, again, when we look at basic utilities, when we look at basic minimum income, when we look at essential health services, and when we look at security, we know there are major holes in our actual situation in most countries in the global south. And when I mention, for example, essential health services, I'm not just referring to the issue of COVID-19. As health delivery systems become overwhelmed, and as resources are concentrated to fight the pandemic, many other issues regarding healthcare are stressed and can, at different points in time, not be adequate for the populations that we need to reach. So here's again critical challenges that we have to confront. Next slide. If there are 4 ingredients for the social safety net, there are 4 parameters for those ingredients if we want an effective emergency social safety net. Those 4 parameters are those of coverage, sufficiency, timing, and time frame. We need to reach the most vulnerable population. No one should be left behind. The negative externalities of leaving people behind these basic 4 ingredients implies that, again, not only social costs will be immense, but the epidemiological strategy will not be effective. Coverage is not enough. Sufficiency, adequate basic quality levels in cash transfers, in security, in healthcare, and in basic utilities. We know already that given our proportion of population living in slums, the proportion of population with no access to drinking water, and the percentages of population in many cases with no access to electricity, this is a tall order. We also know that given our levels of today's, before the pandemic, poverty levels, this is again a tall order. Now, coverage and sufficiency are necessary, but timing and time frame in this particular context are also needed. Timing means that this should be done fast. We cannot wait for a long time to put these different ingredients in place, these different policies in place. The timing is critical because of the epidemiological strategy and because of the immediate ripple effects that lockdowns have on the economy and on social welfare. And finally, time frame. This is not something that we should put together for 1 or 2 months. This is something that we should be looking at for a longer term. I will come back to that later, but let's think that the sustainability of this strategy of a social safety net cannot be thought of as just a short-term emergency response. It has to be a fast emergency response, but built to last for a longer time. Next slide. Let me, as I start to close, move into some issues of the instruments available and an example from Latin America regarding 4 dimensions: the reach of cash transfers, social security coverage, the reach of public utilities, and the cost of extending cash transfers. I don't want you to actually look into the detail of each graph, but let me just tell you very broadly what they mean. The first one shows the emergence of cash transfers policies in Latin America and how between 1996 and 2016-17, they went from covering less than 3% of the population, 5% of the population, to almost 20-25% of the population, concentrated on the most vulnerable sectors, around 120 million people. This constitutes a major instrument that has to be expanded in coverage and extended in quality in terms of the value that we're providing, but it is there in regions and countries across the global south to be used. Secondly, the second graph shows basically coverage in terms of social security by different countries. And here we see the wide variation that we have. Bolivia or Honduras with less than 20% of employed population covered by social security, and Uruguay and Argentina to close to 70%. This, of course, gives again different instruments and capacities that countries can mobilize to provide this emergency response. The third one shows access to electricity, but it could also be showing access to drinking water or to sewage systems. And here it is important to see the deficits we have, how we can create innovative solutions to reach the peripheral areas of our urban centers and the rural areas in order that a lockdown strategy, a confinement strategy, is not a confinement strategy in conditions that are inhabitable in terms of our dwelling places. Also, let's remember that in many countries in the global south, while public utilities remain public, private enterprises are many times the ones delivering them, and there is a price, a tag cost attached to it. We need to guarantee that public utilities will not be cut if people are not able to pay their fees for the time being. Finally, the last graph tries to show that the fiscal effort to reach all households with children below the age of 18, to put an example, in countries like Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Costa Rica, and Colombia, for 3 months or even for 6 months, it's not something that cannot be done in these relatively high-income countries of the global south. It's less than 1 percentage point of GDP. Actually, it's less than half a percentage point of GDP. Actually, it's less than 0.2 points of GDP in many countries. To reach them with universal coverage and to reach them with adequate quality. Of course, this is not true for other countries in which the fiscal effort should be far larger. Next slide. Let me close by showing you this last data, which is simply the GDP per capita, the average GDP per capita of countries that are characterized as low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, upper middle-income countries, and just the example of the euro area that has been going through the pandemic recently. The other graph shows you the tax revenue as a per capita revenue given GDP per capita and total revenue extraction as a percentage of GDP. And we can see the huge differences in the capacities that countries have to face this pandemic from a social perspective and to put in place these basic social safety nets. So unless we develop a system of multilateral cooperation and aid that reaches the global south again rapidly and adequately, many countries will not be able to put in place these social safety nets. Let me go to the last slide. And here's basically what COVID-19 has brought to the fore. It's both the impossible and unacceptable degrees of inequalities, both between nations and within nations. There is an uncertainty that weighs on us all regarding the development of the pandemic and the way in which countries will open up and do the dance between epidemiological concerns and socioeconomic concerns. This should be enough to make us understand that the emergency social safety net should move further and beyond the current predicaments. Such emergency safety net should also be seen as an opportunity to build basic and universal safety nets with adequate provision of public goods and merit goods and basic universal welfare system in the world at large. This requires that the measures that hopefully can be undertaken now will shape a blueprint for both global and domestic action in the future. Let me in close propose a concrete call for action, one that is not yet looking at the fiscal requirements, both in global terms and in national terms, that need to be developed in order to put this safety net in place. Let me just make a call for action regarding measurement instruments. We have been overwhelmed by measurement instruments of COVID cases, death, testing. We have also now have a wide array of measures of stringency closure, confinements, lockdowns. We do not have an adequate dashboard and adequate measurements of the social responses that countries are providing to their populations. Let's call on the G20 leadership to build that platform. Let's have a platform that we can compare best practices, we can look for challenges that lay ahead, we can see instruments available, and we can see how countries are responding from a social perspective to the pandemic and to the epidemiological strategy and the disruptive effects that it has on social and economic well-being of the population. That would be for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fernando, for very insightful keynote. Before we're going to our next speaker, I just want to remind everyone, please, if you have any question, just send it to us in the Q&A box, and we're happy to answer them in the end of the webinar. For our next panel, I would like to welcome the lead co-chair, Dr. Suzanne Al-Qurashi, a professor of organizational behavior and public administration at King Abdulaziz University. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Suzanne, and it's over to you now.
Thank you, Haneen. I would like to welcome all the task force members joining us from across the globe. I also would like to express my gratitude to T20 Chair, Dr. Fahad Al-Turki and Mr. Jihad Al-Yahya for their esteemed opening remarks. I would also like to take a moment to thank Dr. Fernando for his commendable keynote address that fully takes in account the need for social safety net in the times of COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic has taken a toll on the world as we know. It will give a grave implication to social cohesion, public order, and citizen trust in their states. G20 and other world leaders are faced with the challenge of maintaining reasonable levels of trust between the citizen and state institutions without disturbing the social balance. In response to the looming crisis, Saudi Arabia, the current president of G20 2020, had called for an urgent virtual meeting to pave the way forward in this crisis. By the end of 2019, very few had anticipated the spread of COVID-19 virus, let alone its escalation into a pandemic after it was detected in the Chinese province of Wuhan. The increasing number of infections gave way to mass anxiety and socio-economic tensions. Governments are facing escalating cynicism and inquiry on their ability to foresee and cope with contingencies. To combat the influx of infections, most governments have confined the population to their homes to reduce the risk of localized spread of the virus. Although the lockdown measures may have reduced the burden on hospitals and significantly lessened the impact on the virus on the citizens. The confinement is burning down on the citizens. The extended quarantine is demoralizing citizens, may have begun violating lockdowns in part of the world. Social distancing cannot fully be observed in regions of dense population and poor areas. Economic relief packages are being put in place by states to ally the economic and social impact on all, especially the needy. The work towards plans to steadily ease restrictions to revive economy. The crisis has brought forward the wealth divide within the population. It raises concerns on the current prevention made for the essential service workers who have been sidelined previously. It has become imperative that socio-economic reforms are needed in the current economic system that will ensure social justice and reduce grievances in the future. Consequently, our policy brief must reflect the current situation in the task force recommendation to the G20 leaders. In the aftermath of the COVID-19, change in the economic systems and guarantee of the secure supply chains has become necessary. Nonetheless, greater investment in public health system is required at central and rural levels that ensures benefits for all citizens equally. For a more diagnostic review on the effects and how to improve social cohesion in times of COVID-19, I would like to open floor to deliberate further with our respected panelists, the co-chairs. Before they start, I would like to express my appreciation and gratefulness for the time and the great support they have given to Task Force 4. Thank you. We will start with Mark Flurby. Mark is an economist and professor at Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson School, and Center of Human Values. Today, Mark's talk will focus on trade-offs and synergies in economic, social, and health impacts on the current crisis. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Suzanne. So I first would like to thank the organizers of this webinar and the members of the task force, and especially the co-chairs, and in particular, Suzanne Al-Qurashi for her great work on this task force. So what I would like to talk about is the trade-off, the difficult trade-off that many governments are facing between public health priorities and economic concerns in the current crisis. And I would like especially to focus on how social cohesion perspectives can modify or can help navigate this trade-off. I don't think that any government in the world today is focusing exclusively either on public health or on the economy. All are trying to take account of both fronts, but it is difficult to do it in a way that is rational, that is based on science and expertise, and that is politically acceptable to the population. So I will very briefly review some of the approaches that can help clarify the dilemma and the trade-offs that we are facing in this time. There is a standard approach that is used by many administrations for issues of public safety, which is based on cost-benefit analysis and involves putting a value on preserving lives or saving life years, and such value can be compared to the economic cost of the policies that are considered. This approach is relatively simple to use, and many op-eds and experts have been discussing how to proceed with this approach. It is very simple because essentially what you need to do is have an estimate of the value of a statistical life year. You need an estimate of the number of life years lost by every fatality and an estimate of the number of fatalities in the crisis. So you take the product of these three numbers, and that gives you an estimate of the effect of what you do on the health front. And it gives you an estimate that you can compare to the economic cost. So for reasonable values that can be borrowed from the various countries that use such valuing of life years, it looks like the effects of the measures that are being taken range from 5% to 20% of a year of GDP per capita, which is quite substantial and is apparently still in the higher range of the economic cost that we can expect. So the extra cost, and we have to look at the fact that the economic cost of these measures is not the recession that we will endure, because if we did nothing on the epidemiological front, there would be a recession anyway because of the extent of the crisis. And so we need to have an estimate of the extra cost that is induced by the preventive measures, the lockdown measures, even for the most pessimistic estimates over the next 2 years, not just this year, probably around 3% of GDP. And so it looks like this first approach suggests that it is really worth making a strong effort. But I would like to stress that there is another approach, which is more comprehensive and is called by economists the social welfare approach. And it relies on estimating the cost on every individual and on taking an aggregate of the impact on the whole population. And this social welfare approach induces two changes in the perspective. The first is that, contrary to the previous approach, which just aggregates the loss of years on every people in the population, this approach takes account of the fact that those who lose their years of life because of the disease, they lose more than just the value of a statistical life multiplied by the number of years. There is an extra impact due to the fact that the more you lose, the more it is important. So linear approximations underestimate the cost to the people who bear those burdens. And so that's the first thing. So it magnifies the health impact of the crisis, and therefore the health value of preventing the worst health impact. And the second change this approach introduces, and that leads me to bring the social cohesion perspective in this talk, is that it allows you to take account of inequalities. And inequalities in this crisis and in the measures that are taken appear on at three levels. First, the worse off in the population are among the victims of the disease, those who lose their life prematurely, and those who are usually among the worse off in the population already due to poverty issues. So the worse off are among the victims, but also the second point is that the access to health can reduce inequalities in fatalities. And we see in many countries that fatalities are concentrated on the poorest populations, and that is something that should be taken into account. And finally, social policies can help reduce inequalities on two fronts. They can reduce inequalities in life expectancy, and that is a long-term perspective, but they can also help reduce the inequalities or inequities in the distribution of the economic burden of the recession. And the social policies that we just heard about from Fernando Filgueira can play an important role here. And so when you apply this social welfare approach, what do you get compared to the cost-benefit approach I mentioned earlier? Well, the outlook is more favorable to ambitious public health policies against the pandemic, because at least provided that you take account of the inequality considerations, and therefore this is something that shows that social cohesion pushes not so much in the direction of taking account of the economy first, but is compatible with ambitious epidemiological strategies. Finally, in my closing words, I'd like to mention the fact that a crisis such as this one is very hard for decision makers, for policy makers, because the structure of the situation is such that you need to inflict pain, economic and social pain on the population because of the lockdown and social distancing measures, until you reach the level at which you can quash the pandemic and crush the waves of infection. And so this is a very difficult situation, because you need to explain, you need to have strong leadership to explain and to achieve, and you need cooperation from the population. And the political situation may not allow you to do that. So you need to combine a strong shutdown measures for long enough and accompanied with ambitious testing and in coordination between your jurisdiction, which is something that is not always easy to do, especially in large countries. So doing all of that is necessary to obtain the good outcome of quashing the pandemic early. And if you don't succeed in doing that, the drama of the current crisis is that all the efforts you've done are essentially a waste. And this is like fire extinction. If you don't manage to quash the fire, it will start again, and it will spread just as strongly as before. And so this is a consideration that is making the situation very difficult for policymakers. But if you look at social cohesion perspective, if you put a high priority on those who will lose from this crisis, and if you have a very strong concern for the worse off, actually the cost that you impose on the population doesn't appear that hard, because the worse off really are the most disadvantaged people who will lose their lives prematurely. And so putting priority on those really makes the public health gain appear much more important than the immediate economic cost that is imposed on the population. Of course, that requires accompanying social to curb the inequality consequences. So to conclude, I think that it is important, as has already been said, to not to lose sight of social cohesion. But moreover, I think we can robustly say that having a strong concern for social cohesion is not going against ambitious epidemiological strategies. Actually, it rather supports them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike, for your insightful talk. I hope our authors can take this in account while drafting their final policy briefs, highlighting the impact as well as offering conclusive resolution to them. We move to Gianluca Grimaldi, a senior researcher at the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Gianluca has been contributor to the Task Force on Social Cohesion for T20 Japan, Argentina, and Germany. He will talk about global social cohesion in the time of COVID-19. Gianluca, the floor is yours. You can share the screen now, Gianluca.
Yes, thank you very much. So
Yeah.
to share the screen, I need, yes, I can do that now, I think.
Okay, great.
Okay, let me thank you for the possibility of talking here. And I think my presentation will echo.
Yes, you have 5 to 7 minutes, okay?
Yes.
Or a maximum 8.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'll do my best. So I wanted to start off with, in a way, the foundations of social cohesion. And according to some political scientists and also the Bertelsmann Foundation, social cohesion is based on different dimensions. So there is a subjective and an objective component. So subjective component refers to the perceptions and the attitudes of the people, while the objective component refers to the actual actions taken by citizens and the governments. While the vertical, the other dimension refers to the horizontal and vertical dimension. So horizontal dimension refers to interactions between citizens, and the vertical dimension refers to the interactions between citizens and governments. So you can see from this table that there are actually many different domains under social cohesion. And for instance, the Bertelsmann Foundation develops an indicator that is based on 12 different dimensions. And in the course of this presentation, I wanted to focus on 4 of them. And of course, I'm under heavy time constraints, so I'll give you a very general overview. Just to precisely give you an idea of how we can look at social cohesion from different perspectives. And of course, the main contribution that I'm trying to give is to look at social cohesion from the global perspective. So following on the footsteps of what Fernando was saying before. So an important aspect of social cohesion is trust between people, but also trust between the citizens and the government. And in general terms, trust in political institutions are at the lowest level. So this table takes data from a survey conducted by the OECD called the Trust Lab, looking at 6 industrialized countries in terms of how they fare with respect to trust. And you can notice that trust in government and trust in parliament are at the lowest level in every country compared to for instance, trust in the judicial system, in financial institutions, in the media, and at the top is always a trust in one's family. So, of course, we need to understand why that is the case. And here I wanted to report some data that are really fresh. We literally collected these data. We finished collecting this data yesterday. So it's a part of a survey on public opinions and reactions towards COVID in the US, in which we interviewed 830 people. Some of the questions inquired about the level of trust in state-level politicians in the US, where state level means, for instance, California, Texas, so something that is important, of course. And then we asked about trust in national level politicians and trust in world politicians. And we asked whether trust had increased, decreased, or remained stable as an effect of the reaction to COVID. And here you can see that, well, opinions on state-level politicians have remained more or less the same in this sample. So the amount of people saying that their trust had increased more or less matches the amount of people who said that their trust had decreased. But if we move to trust at the national level, then we observe a big decrease in trust in country-level politicians. And trust in world level politicians is somehow intermediate. So we see that many more people say that their trust had decreased towards world politicians as an effect of their reaction to COVID. So this is just to show, of course, this is only one country and one relatively small sample, but this is just to say that the people really react and that their levels of trust can change even with respect to world level politicians. Then a second aspect that I wanted to grapple with is redistribution. So here I'm going to take a very specific angle of redistribution. So I'm talking about mainly financial facilities. So this is a graph taken from the International Monetary Fund, looking at the number of countries that have accessed the financial debt relief. Okay, so you can see, so these were institutions, so these were programs that were already in place before the COVID crisis. And you can see that many African countries, some Latin American countries, and also some Asian countries have already taken advantage of these facilities. So I would say the facilities that were there to issue either credit or debt relief have been active. But this is not enough. So according to, for instance, Barry Eichengreen, one of the most notable financial economists, so the current global response to COVID is echoing a wrong response that was taken in 1982 when there was another big crisis in debt for developing countries. And the mistake, and this really echoes what Fernando was saying before, so the big mistake in 1982 with the Baker Plan was to assume that the crisis would be over very soon. And so what was proposed at that time was a moratorium, so a suspension of the interest payments by developing countries. And this is exactly what is taking place now. So the G20 has promised a moratorium on the payment of debt. But we saw already in the 80s that this strategy didn't work because the crisis was much longer than what was originally thought. And then in the end, some forms of debt relief or writing off the debt or restructuring the debt had to be put in place. And so I think it is pretty clear that sooner or later, some forms of really more substantial intervention in terms of debt relief of developing countries will be in order. And as Mark was saying before, the sooner the better. And another aspect that I wanted to grapple with very briefly has to do with global care. So I will just give you basically the conclusions of the analysis that I have tried to develop for my engagement with this task force. So I think it is almost, I would say, a platitude that a global vaccine is the quintessential global public good. So it's something that everybody is going to benefit from. It is something that is known in principle. It implies a non-rivalry in consumption. So finding a global vaccine should really be the outcome of a global effort. And here what we see is that there are some actors that are moving in this direction. So in particular, some countries led by the European Union, but also with the support of other countries like Saudi Arabia, Japan, and others have supported this call to create really a global effort to find, to discover, and to deliver a vaccine. So the leaders of this group have said that any potential vaccine should be available, accessible, and affordable to all. But what we send here, you can see the list of how much money countries have promised to this effort. But some countries, notably the US, have sat down of this international effort, and the US are basically funding some national efforts to develop a vaccine. The situation is a little bit more complicated, but I don't have time to go into the detail. And China has kept a low profile in these international efforts. So it is important to stress that there is both a global initiatives towards finding a vaccine, but also national initiatives which presumably are going to put nationals first as opposed to global citizens. And finally, I'm aware that I'm already exceeding my time, but very briefly, so this in a way again echoes what Fernando had already said and what Mark had said, so I don't need to bring more data saying that COVID has disproportionately hit people from the disadvantaged classes. So for instance, there is evidence that in the US, Afro-Americans have been disproportionately hit by COVID. And also that economically disadvantaged classes cannot go on lockdown. So they are in a way forced to go to work, and that they cannot maintain the safe physical distancing that instead is required. As Fernando said, we have very sparse data. I would say it's almost non-existent at the moment, the systematic data on the response. So there are anecdotal evidence, for instance, of people walking 600 kilometers in India to move from their place of residence to their place of origins because they cannot find food, and they have to walk because the state is not providing any support for that. The World Bank estimates that global poverty will increase as effect of COVID by 40 million people. And so as a part of the work of this task force, we are proposing together with Mark, Fernando, and Ruben Lowolo to institutionalize precisely the type of intervention that Fernando was talking about. So making this global safety net permanent by the institution of a global universal basic income that should be funded with some forms of global taxation. So I'll stop there, and of course you are welcome to read our policy briefs as soon as they will be available. So just in the way of conclusion, I would say that the scale of a global cooperation is not negligible, but definitely much more should be done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gianluca, for your profound words, and I hope the authors can use the takeaways from your talk today. We go to our third co-chair, Abla Adel Latif. Abla is originally professor of economics at AUC, is currently the chair of the Presidential Advisory Council for Economic Development and the executive director and director of research of the Egyptian Center for Economic Studies, ECES. Abla will talk on COVID-19 has a social cohesion silver lining. Abla, the floor is yours.
Everyone involved in the organization and the work in T20 for all their efforts, and I would like to thank Dr. Suzanne Al-Orashti for all her efforts, and take the opportunity to congratulate her also for her recent promotion to full professorship. It's a lovely thing, so congratulations. Okay, having said that, let me you're welcome. Let me start by actually making a quotation from the time of Winston Churchill. He said, "The pessimist sees difficulty in every opportunity. The optimist sees the opportunity in every difficulty." And it's from that angle that I see the silver lining in COVID-19, as horrible as it is a problem. And I see the silver lining, particularly in the area of social cohesion. So there is something positive that came out of this difficult situation that we're in. As we all know, there is a lot of rhetoric on social cohesion. Everybody talks about it. There is a lot of talk on the need to focus on social justice, on equitable development, areas of social protection, social inclusion, safety nets, okay, women empowerment, equal services and education and health services for all, equal rights in voting, decentralization and the right for everybody to be part of the management of the country, role for civil society. All of these are elements and parts of the social cohesion that we hear a lot talk about, okay? But from this talk, okay, the only conclusion actually is what says water everywhere, but not a single drop to drink, which means that there isn't anything tangible or something touchable, because all countries seem to be proceeding with their economic growth efforts, talking about these things, but not doing anything about them and putting them on the side. What COVID-19 did, and this is the silver lining part, is that it brought the social cohesion up to the front of everything. And in that sense, it's a blessing in disguise that was needed by humanity, I suppose. Suddenly, everyone realized that we are all equal, regardless of our color, religion, social status, financial situation. COVID-19 disease treated us equally, okay? And this is a very, very important thing to observe. The second thing, we also noticed that we are all connected in life. So we are all actually part of a whole, the life value chain involves all of us, and we are all connected in it. There is no person that is insignificant. There is no job that is petty. We are all part of it. Whether we're talking about inside the country or between countries, it's one life, it's one economic system, and it matters. We realize also that civil society is very, very important. Okay, it's not a luxury element or factor in the system. It is actually very important because it can complement the efforts of the government in solving problems. We realize that everyone has a right actually to decent health services, decent education, and we realize something that's very important for me and for Dr. Suzanne and for all our gender, okay, and that's the importance of the role of women. Okay, women are involved in the medical field significantly, they're involved in the education system, and they are mothers, and in all those three levels they were hit badly during the crisis. They are part of the labor force, and they are not contributing enough. They're not allowed to contribute more than that, while they should. There are estimates that say that rates of growth of economies in different countries would increase by as much as 30% if women are participating fully. Okay? Having realized all of this, we are hoping that our world post-COVID
the voice, Abla. The connection, maybe.
We lost Abla.
Abla.
Yes, can you still hear me?
Yeah. You come back again.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So as we heard from the previous people who talked before me, there were many people left behind. So even as we try to address the situation, there are many people that are left behind. So the big question is whether we have learned our lesson enough, that the way we are dealing with social cohesion is not exactly correct, and it cannot be simply with few scattered social programs. This will not solve issues. We are hoping that hopefully the world is going to be run differently in post-COVID era. My hope and my dream is that government policies address social inclusion in every way, not as a social policy dimension on the side, but rather as part of the economic policy, and that's extremely important. We cannot talk about inclusive growth unless we have the social policies as part of the economic policies. The welfare of the economy is actually conditional upon the inclusion. And the more stronger and better governance of the economy that we have, the more we can allow for social inclusion. So it's very, very important that these two do not get separated from each other, because this is a mistake that many countries do. My second point here, and here I second Dr. Fernando in his suggestion for having a dashboard that would monitor government efforts to support their people. And actually my two colleague co-chairs said the same thing about the need for the global safety net and for the need for the debt relief for the situation to continue to be sustainable for people. This whole thing boils into having international collaboration very highly in order to make sure that all people are protected. We need to guarantee universal basic income to all and have universal social safety net, and this is a key recommendation. Another suggestion that I would like to add is for G20 as well, is to have international organizations such as the World Bank and the IMF sort of link their support efforts to the extent that the government is supporting the people, so that governments are actually forced to pay attention to the needs of the people and to social cohesion, and not set it on the side. Because my fear, and this is actually my last word, my fear is that as soon as the crisis is over, and after a while we go back to our normal life, then we go back also to our normal habits. Okay? And our normal habits would involve ignoring the vulnerable, ignoring the social dimension. So I'm hoping that our attention to the humanitarian element, which is really the core of development anywhere in the world, continues, okay, and does not disappear after we control the disease, hopefully soon. Corrections would be done for good, so that we could have a better life for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abra, for the thought-provoking talk. And truly, this crisis has shown us that there does lie a silver lining in the darkest clouds. Well, I have not few questions to you, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. I will go to the next part of our panel, to the author presentation, and hopefully we have sufficient time at the end. I will come back to you just to answer the questions I prepared. We will go now to our authors. We will start with Merrick Blofeld. She's a director of the Institute of Latin American Study in University of Hamburg. The floor is yours, Merrick.
Let me see. Okay.
Yes, we can see you now.
Thank you.
Hello.
I need to share the screen, please.
Yes. Yes.
Can I share it now?
Yes.
Excellent. And slideshow. Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, so this is I'll speak a little bit to social cohesion of families, and it's based on work that I'm doing with Fernando Filgueira, the keynote speaker, and so this is co-authored.
I'm sorry, just to remind you, you have 5 to 7 minutes. Sorry.
Excellent. I will try my best. You tell when it's 5 minutes, tell me to stop talking.
Okay.
Okay, so I want to talk about the social and family impact of COVID-19. We know this well. Currently, there's over 1.2 billion children out of school and daycare. So ECEC is early childhood education and care. At the same time, the economic effects, of course, have been devastating, and informal sectors around the world especially have come to a halt. And this has resulted that low-income households across the world, especially, of course, concentrated in the global south, where the margins of survival are so much tighter, and households with children, for the reasons that children are entirely socially dependent, materially dependent on their families, are particularly at risk. For food insecurity, as well as for all sorts of other measures of broader well-being related to being out of school and and so on. And I just want to stress two fault lines through which the COVID-19 is affecting individual and family well-being especially. Well, one is the fault lines of inequalities between households and families. And the other one is fault lines of inequalities within households and families. So as I mentioned, children are most at risk of extreme poverty. And here I'm going to draw on information on Latin America, which is the region I know best, but I think that many of these points apply to other regions as well. This is CEPAL data from last year on the share. This is pre-pandemic data. About half of children in Latin America before the pandemic already were in poverty. So you can see a huge demographic difference. I mean, although the elderly are most at risk of contracting COVID, socially, the children are most at risk of poverty in the region. Here is data based on a data set from Fernando and I are working on together about the type of household by income quintile. What this shows is if you look at the first income quintile, which is the poorest, here, virtually every person in low-income households lives with children. Only 15% of low-income households are households without children. At the same time, although the majority live in dual-parent households, there's a high increasing share of monoparental households, which are the vast majority of which are women. This is also, these kinds of dynamics are also the case, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, Caribbean, the United States, to a lesser extent in areas of Asia and the Middle East. And then if you look at quintile 5, about half the households there are without children. And so the twin shocks of the economic loss of livelihood from the informal sector coming to the halt, as well as the school closings, is really hitting low-income households especially very hard. And one survey that just came out by the IADB on Latin America shows that 70% of people who lived in low-income households reported losing their jobs in the last 2 months. So the economic effect is devastating. And I would just stress again what everybody's already said. There's a desperate need for broad and sufficient emergency social protection floors with areas of inclusion rather than exclusion. So everybody should be included. We can worry about if somebody is actually not deserving later. And here I would also stress that migrants, somebody mentioned migrants, but migrants documented and undocumented should be included in this. The other is the dynamics and inequalities within families and how the COVID epidemic is stressing those. The traditional gender division of domestic work is overwhelming women's, especially mothers' burden right now, because you have the concomitant income loss as well as all the kids being at home. This is the number of hours. This is a gender gap. This isn't a total number. This is the gender gap in unpaid labor. Number of hours more per week that women do domestic and care work at home compared to men. You have Latin America, South Africa, India, China, and then some areas of the West where it's less. It's partly less because men there's more paternal co-responsibility, and also because the states take over, markets and states take over more there. But this gap is especially high in India, and it's high in South Africa and Latin America as well. This is the total hours of work. So this is paid and unpaid work. And so it's not just that women do more unpaid labor at home. If you calculate the total number of work, women work more than men. This is pre-pandemic data around the world. And so, of course, with the pandemic, all of this is being exacerbated. And here again, low-income women especially bear the highest burden because they have less resources and they have less space. Also, we're talking a lot about cramped households. Here is one graph very briefly. This is from Fernando's work, and this is from Ecuador. An example, what this shows is the solid lines are men, the dotted lines are women, the line blue is the poorest, the orange is the wealthiest income quintile, and then the gray is in between. And this shows the number of daily hours allocated to unpaid work over a life cycle. And basically, in a nutshell, what this shows is that no matter what happens when men have kids, if they don't have kids, if they're young, if they're old, they do very little and they don't change their behavior, their life cycle. Women, on the other hand, bear the burden when they have children, and low-income women especially. And so these pre-pandemic statistics are now being aggravated around the world. So government policies, I mean, there's only so much you can do in a crisis, but one is there's a desperate need to encourage more male co-responsibility, paternal co-responsibility. There's different kinds of campaigns that can be done to this effect. Policies take much longer to institute, but there's room for cultural awareness campaigns. And the second is that we're also working on with Fernando is the issue of taking this reality into account when staggering the opening of schools and the economy. Italy is now, Italy opened the economy without opening the schools, and that can take, you know, some economists and scholars are saying it's going to take gender equality in the labor force back several decades potentially, and here in Germany we're having the same debates. This is especially the case in, just as much the case in the global south. So then I would like to point to two pandemics that where families also are critical sites. And here, the first, and here I would like to stress that this is something that Fernando has especially been speaking about, is the issue, as you all know, that the prevalence of extended households is a mode of survival in poor households. And what happens here is that you bring the children and the elderly together, and if and when schools are opened up, and probably we see increased spreading of the virus, elderly and these households, which are concentrated in low-income households, are at a higher risk of infection. And that's an issue. The second is the silent epidemic that now is receiving more attention, but the epidemic of violence, domestic gender-based violence, especially against girls and women, that given that in general, pre-pandemic data says affects over 30% of the population globally. And now with the pandemic, with COVID-19, it's creating conditions for a perfect storm of both increased risk factors of higher levels of violence in the home, as well as, of course, reduced exit options in these, with the policies of containment. Here, one solution that we propose, what governments really should do in the very immediate, short, and potentially medium term is institute viable exit options for those that are at risk of either of these two pandemics. And one way to do this is that as they negotiate these massive rescue, financial rescue packages, that one way to do it would be, there's a lot of space right now in empty hotels where governments could subsidize hotels and these industries that are at the verge of collapse at low prices and provide free or subsidized lodging for these two risk groups that are at tremendous risk of these two pandemics. There's an example of an entire hotel in Belgium being requisitioned by the government for women fleeing violence in the conditions of COVID. That's it. I think I'm at 5 minutes.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much for such an insightful talk, Mary. Thank you so much. Well, we will move to our second author, Matthews Urban. He is the chair of early childhood education and the director of the Early Childhood Research Center, Dublin City University. Matthews, the floor is yours. Matthews?
Hello, everybody. I'm
Yes.
just trying to get my screen to you. It says I can't share my screen.
Okay. Yes, now you will. Yes.
Okay. There we go.
Yeah, we can see it now. Just make it full screen.
Right.
Yes.
Well, just to briefly follow up on some of the very important remarks already made by Marike, I'm going to talk about through a lens of early childhood development, education, and care in relation to this whole disruption of services and in relation to social cohesion. So briefly titled Crisis Disruption, but also sort of looking towards a silver lining transitions that are happening in early childhood education and care and early childhood development globally. Just to briefly say and to acknowledge this is the work of a group of co-authors which I'm coordinating. And so behind all this is Dr. Jennifer Guevara, who works as a postdoc researcher with us at Dublin City University, Dr. Alejandra Cardini from CPEC, the public policy think tank in Buenos Aires, Argentina, Lynette Okengo, who's the executive director of the African Early Childhood Network, and I think Lynette, you're in the audience. Hi, if you are. Rita Flores Romero, who leads the research group on cognition and language in early childhood at the National University of Colombia. Dr. Claudia Costin from Sao Paulo, and Dr. Dwi Priono, who heads the Regional Center for Early Childhood Care, Education and Parenting, run by the South Asian Ministers of Education Organization in Jakarta, in Indonesia. So it's a collective work. Looking at what's happening in our across these global regions, what we can see is that the current pandemic has disrupted programs to support young children, their families and communities in all affected countries and regions in the global south and global north, to varying extents, but there is sort of a general disruption happening as we speak. This closure of services has had immediate negative effects on children and families, on the early childhood workforce, and on entire societies and economies. What we're seeing is that countries at the moment are learning the hard way and very fast that early childhood services are essential public services. And what we're also seeing is, and we've heard this in previous talks, that the disruption to early childhood services has compounded existing inequalities and created a whole palette of new ones. Looking at the effects on children, we see the disappearance overnight of stimulating play and learning opportunities in social settings. We see a lack of safe spaces outside the family home. We see a lack of access to nutrition and healthcare, including basic hygiene, running water in many cases. And this affects young children in both affluent and poor countries. All children are affected, but inequalities within countries, and we've heard about that, exacerbate the situation for children from the most marginalized communities. And there is a list, and it could go on. It's children in rural communities, children from indigenous communities, migrant children, displaced communities, very much affecting Roma population across Europe. In general, children from the poor communities. What we're also seeing is that the current health crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, carries the risk of developing into a global children's rights crisis. Looking at families for a moment, what we see is the collapse of reliable childcare, which often contributes or aggravates to sudden loss of income for families. Which is particularly severe for what we now recognize as key workers, for instance, healthcare workers, but also people working in retail, who simply cannot go to work because there is no childcare. And of course, beyond the sort of institutional settings of preschools, early childhood education, childcare, it's the vast disruption of parenting supports around that. So the whole area of early childhood development, including health, nutrition, and I mentioned that. Looking towards effects on society and economy, we see immediate effects, which are really about realizing that the closure of schools, and Marika, you mentioned that, and preschools and childcare services has impeded countries' ability to respond to the immediate health crisis. So what we're seeing is that key workers, and I mentioned nurses, healthcare workers, they're staying at home to look after children. They've become unavailable for their frontline role in hospitals, and we see this across a number of countries. We do see that staff in early childhood are quite often in very precarious employment arrangements and have lost their livelihoods. And we see a medium and long-term effect already emerging, that in many countries an over-reliance on private, and quite often private for-profit provision, means that the business model has collapsed, which already sort of indicates that post-COVID, many services will not be open, will not be able to reopen once the epidemic recedes. So the structural crisis is already at the doorstep. So there's a lack of reliable and sustainable services for young children and their families, and this will have, and we see this already on the horizon, will have very serious implications for countries to restart their economies once the COVID-19 crisis recedes. How can I move this forward? Oh, yeah. There are some exacerbating factors in most countries. There is a critical lack of data across all regions, especially what we're not seeing enough is disaggregated data on children from diverse ethnic, cultural, socioeconomic, geographical backgrounds.
We have 1 minute left.
Yes, we're getting there. There are some notable exceptions, and I want to sort of mention Latin America here. Countries like Colombia that, for instance, now have put in place an integrated early childhood policy framework that allows for not just delivery of services, but also for monitoring and for data collection, which makes sort of the response easier. There's chronic and persistent underfunding of services, even in the most affluent countries. There's fragmentation of services, lack of strategy, leadership, and cross-sectoral policy coordination. And there is, which has been mentioned before, a risk of the sort of stimulus packages now that are put in place, pushing poorer countries into unsustainable levels of debt again due to a lack of international solidarity and coordination. Looking forward, and this is the last slide, what we are beginning to sort of see emerging as sort of the policy choices for a post-COVID new normal is that it will be increasingly important to recognize the crucial role played by early childhood development, education and care for children, families and communities and for the entire society, which means restructuring the sector as a vital public service, going back to the last year's T20 recommendation, or the adopted recommendation, saying that it is about strengthening government responsibility for locally and culturally appropriate early childhood services for all children. We urgently have to learn within countries across the global south and north, especially countries who have already adopted integrated policy frameworks, and Uruguay is an example, Colombia is an example, just looking at Latin America. And we have to refocus the purpose and content of early childhood education and care in a post-COVID world. This crisis is an existential crisis, but it's the likelihood of other crises arising in the future on a global scale is increasing. We are going to see further pandemics. We are going to see a climate crisis.
Time, sorry.
And we are seeing sort of economic models being dysfunctional, which really means that the fundamental question has to shift from sort of how can we deliver programs that we have been used to before the crisis to a fundamental reorientation. For instance,
time finished.
What should we be educating for? Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, but we are really running. Thank you so much, Matthews. Yes, Fernando. Yes.
Yes. To forgive me, I do need to leave the meeting now because I have another. Let me tell you this. My presentation was based on the work that we've done together with Marika Blofield for Latin America. Yeah. So to think about the broader issues of social safety net, Marika can also take upon some of the questions.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for your participation. Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you, everybody, for a wonderful meeting.
Thank you. So we will move to our third authors, Florenza Caro Sacchi. She's a coordinator, social protection program at CEPIC. The floor to you, Florenza.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Susan and organizers, for the invitation to participate, and congratulations to all task force members for their valuable work and presentations. So my presentation will follow a little bit on Marika's and Matthias' insightful remarks on the effects of the pandemic on care, in this case, following especially on migrant care workers. So as many of the key issues have already been addressed by them, I will try to keep it as short as possible. So nowadays, we live in a really evolving world that as the COVID-19 crisis evolves, we see how uncertainty invades every aspect of our lives, and increasingly governments worldwide recognize the need to implement innovative actions to respond to the emergency. While overturning our routines, in a way, the COVID-19 crisis pointed out what truly matters for our well-being. And in this process, it unveiled the fact that remained mostly unspoken, which is that care work is essential for sustaining life as we know it. Care and domestic work, whether paid or unpaid, encompasses diverse activities from cooking and cleaning to caring for children, the sick, and the elderly. And we see how the care sector involves the essential healthcare systems, but also domestic work, cleaning services, and the unpaid care labor undertaken by families and communities. The pandemic exposed the importance of these activities to society and economy, as now a lot of people need extra care. We see some getting sick, others being too vulnerable to care for themselves, and children at home due to schools and daycare centers closures. At the same time, we see how elder long-term care services struggle to avoid the spread of the disease, and hospitals are overburdened in many places around the world. The effects of this heightened care demand are far from egalitarian. As Marika said before, globally, care and domestic work, both paid and unpaid, falls disproportionately on women. Estimation shows that women perform around 76% of the total care work worldwide. Yet among women, there are also some inequalities, as it is the poorer ones who bear a heavy burden of unpaid work. Because during the last 50 years, women have massively entered the labor force, but men have not started doing much more care. Therefore, households have increasingly relied on hiring other people, usually women, to provide care and domestic work. In this globalized world, this fueled the global care chain, as poorer women migrate across borders, both external and internal, to provide care. Migrant care workers face intersecting struggles related to migration, care, class, ethnicity, and gender, among others. They often work in the informal economy, perceive low wages, lack access to social protection, and see their rights affected. As care is feminized, this has clear implications for gender equality. Global care chains involve unskilled labor occurring in households as unskilled activities such as healthcare provision. They are the nurses, the doctors, the domestic workers, and the caregivers. In the OECD countries, 10% of total migrant workers are occupied in healthcare, social, or domestic work. And according to estimations, 30% of doctors, 16% of nurses, and 28% of domestic caregivers are foreigners, most of them women. Migrant care workers are at the forefront of containing the pandemic, but they are mostly absent from public debates and policy proposals. But we see that the challenges they are facing are myriad. First, due to the nature of the activities they conduct, combined with the lack of appropriate personal protective equipment, they are particularly exposed to infection. This is quite obvious for doctors and nurses, but also true for workers in domestic settings or elder care homes, which have proven to be hotspots of COVID-19 across the world. Moreover, due to their low pay, they usually work part-time in multiple places to afford a living, and this increases the risk of infection. Second, many migrant care workers are in irregular status. While most countries around the world have implemented measures to mitigate the socioeconomic consequences of the crisis, these migrants cannot access any social protection policies, including relief packages, public cash transfers, and unemployment or health insurance. Additionally, feeling sick, they might even avoid going to hospitals for fear of being reported. Third and related, migrant domestic workers depict high rates of labor informality. In many countries, even if they have documentation, they are not covered by the general labor regime. This, of course, leaves them in a very vulnerable situation. In addition to the health risks, they may face either heavier workloads with no higher pay due to families staying at home, or a higher threat of losing their job and thus their income as they cannot work due to lockdowns and they lack labor rights. Also, migrants might be especially affected by mobility restrictions. Migrant care workers are usually women who migrate by themselves, leaving their family in their home country. While borders closed do not provide many options at this point, it is important to note how vulnerable a migrant care worker might be if they lose their income and cannot return with their family. Finally, there is something that does not affect migrant care workers themselves, but it is still relevant, that many migrant doctors, nurses, and caregivers who work today in the developed world come from poorer countries which, amid the COVID-19 crisis, might face shortages of medical staff. Therefore, ethical recruitment also comes to the forefront. All in all, the pandemic removed the cloak on how vital the care economy is, and we can only wonder how much would GDP forecast vary if unpaid work was not statistically invisible. Global care chains depicted challenges before this crisis, which are now increased. To build longer-term resilience to communities and societies, and to achieve better social cohesion, we need to guarantee social protections for all, as the previous colleagues mentioned in their presentations, and we need to rethink the implicit gender dynamics of care and how these intersect with class, poverty, ethnicity, and other inequalities. Policy challenges remain in terms of providing documentation and social protection, fostering policy coherence among countries, and above all, recognizing the real value of care. We do not know yet what the COVID-19 will imply for global care chains, but at some point, the international mobility of care workers will likely resume. Hopefully, it will come with some transformation in the structure of our societies that prevents a deepening inequalities. As a society, we are probably more conscious today than we were a year ago about the fact that
30
our
seconds
lives...
only, Florenza. Left, 30 seconds.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm finished.
No, finish, 30 seconds.
So we are more conscious today than we were before that we'll give or receive care at some point. And gratitude and applauses for our care workers are a really good gesture, but it would be even better to recognize their invaluable work by guaranteeing their rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Florencia, for your talk. And we go at last, not least, to our last author, Jürgen Bernstein. He's a fellow researcher at Harvard Kennedy School. The floor to you is yours. Yeah. Yes.
Share the screen?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you. Does it work? Can you see?
Yes. You have only 5 minutes. I'm sorry to say that.
Okay, no worries. Okay. Yeah, thank you. So thanks for being part of this great panel. So before I am starting on the presentation on social cohesion and the link to diagnostics, just a brief overview. Like I would like to start with a personal story, why to bring diagnostics into the story of social cohesion. Then the major challenge in terms of the global diagnostic deficit and our proposal with regard to establishing a global coordination platform through the G20. So why to write such a policy brief? Like it was about 3 months ago, I was invited to a round table at a nice restaurant in Boston, and that was hosted by an asset manager, and he also invited a couple of other people included economists, health professionals, and also an epidemiologist. And that was around the case when the pandemic was still at the early stage, concentrated in China. It's where more than 95% of the cases were in China and 15 cases in the US at that time. And the discussion revolved mainly on two perspectives or two major concerns, like in terms of health, that would be health infrastructure, and in terms of economics, like there might be a recession, and some sectors might be more exposed, like the travel industry. At that time, 3 months ago, one issue that was completely missing was the social consequences and the social cohesion. But this changed rapidly. In mid of May, so this picture is taken just a few blocks from where I'm sitting now in Boston, which illustrates, this is a bit more radical picture from another state. And it just illustrates that what Mareike also mentioned in terms of the social consequences became very apparent over the last 2 months. And this is has to be seen in the context of the sweeping government measures that have been taken around the world in terms of the precautionary lockdowns, social distancing measures, intrusive state legislations, which actually have implications. And we have all seen this great mobility reports from Apple, Google, illustrating the massive impact on every aspect of this social mobility and on impacting the fabric of society in terms of unemployment, and we have heard that. So the question is now, being in the midst of this crisis, and probably given that it's not the end of it, and where everybody talking about reopening and exiting, it will be back to the basic medical trials, in addition to also technological innovation to get this pandemic in control. However, in the absence of a vaccine, and still in terms of the non-existence of an effective treatment, we are left with diagnostics. And that was also highlighted by actually every organization, or all of the major organizations like the WHO, the CDC, and other health experts. They all agree on the central importance of diagnostics in the reopening and the widespread diagnostics. Despite this importance of diagnostics, and also in terms, policy leaders accepted the importance of diagnostics, probably not in every country, but let's say in most of the countries. And we're seeing a global diagnostic deficit. For instance, recently the Harvard Institute of Global Health highlighted that it would need to be between 500 and 700,000 tests on a daily basis to safely reopen the United States. And currently we have only 150,000 tests available. So how to explain this deficit and how to respond to this problem? So it's not really a matter of capacity, of manufacturing capacity. This could be easily illustrated by looking at the United States. 10 of the 20 largest diagnostic companies are actually based in the US. So it's not an issue of throwing more money out and creating more companies. So it's all there. And what we argue, it's a governance issue. And here this illustrates, this rocket illustrates the demand shock towards diagnostics.
Yeah.
And
we have
here,
you have only 60 seconds, okay?
60 seconds, okay. So this demand shock for diagnostics, so there's no demand, this is related to a problem, there's no demand for diagnostics until the outbreak happens. And then everybody, literally everybody around the world wants it. So it's a demand shock to which conventional market mechanisms in the diagnostic market cannot respond. So they are just, it's literally a shock. And therefore, given that you cannot leave it just to markets, nor to the state, we're suggesting the creation of a global coordination platform for diagnostics in pandemic preparedness. And this is nothing really, it's not rocket science, or we just proposing, emulating already a blueprint, which is already there for rapid vaccine development. And we proposing using this blueprint, applying it to diagnostic preparedness, and the G20 would be an ideal forum to address this, or to initiate such a sort of initiative towards a global coordination platform for pandemic diagnostics.
Okay. So we finished?
Yes, we finished.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm very sorry to interrupt your interesting presentation and full of information, but it's a really insufficient time, and we have just tied up the end. And well, I have very quick, if the co-chairs can quick, in a brief, short brief, just give, would like each of them give one a piece of advice to the authors that will help them make their policy briefs noteworthy and gain recognition from G20 leaders. Can we start with you, Abla, but quickly, in a brief, please. Abla, are you there?
I'm here. All right,
yes.
I'm here. The writers of the policy briefs have to remember that the policy briefs are addressed to the G20 and are addressed to actions that can be taken by a large group of countries to the interests of the 20 countries and everybody else in the world. So they should avoid writing stuff that's at the research stage. They should go quickly for the policy conclusions and remember who they are addressed to. That's my advice, and has always been the case from the beginning.
Thank you. Mike?
Yes,
yes.
I want to thank the authors.
In short, please.
Yes, so I want to thank the authors, and I don't have any strong recommendation to change. I think they've developed a really promising work, and it will be very relevant. I only want to suggest that they have focused on certain basic services and certain basic policy. So perhaps it would be nice to always put that in the perspective, the broader perspective of where do they fit in the broader picture of all the policies. We cannot cover all the policies that are essential for social cohesion, but always let's put what we do in perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you. Gianluca?
No, I don't have anything to add with.
Just, okay, thank you so much. I'm very thankful to all the attendants, really. I'm really happy to have you all here. Before we close the session, the webinar, I want to remind the authors of the upcoming workshop on the June, I think June 13, and end of June, we will discuss the recommendations. And something else, I email you that the deadline of the final draft policy brief, it will be 20 June, but you can request an extension to the 30th of June, just to give, why I always like the first draft requested in advance before the final deadline to the T20 Secretary to give us time to review the final one before we submitted the final submission. Thank you all for your attention and for your time being with us. Thank you for people who are very far away from here and for dedicating your time with me, and where any things you can communicate with me as usual by Skype or email or WhatsApp. Thank you, and see you June, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for hosting.